Welcome, everyone. Hard to tell by my name, but I am originally from Colombia, from South America. So Latina is definitely part of my middle name. I also have a Lebanese background and grew up here in the States for, a chunk of 10 years and then another chunk of 10 years. I've actually been here now for 14 years. And I had my training, like they mentioned, like Kathy mentioned, here at UT for psychiatry as well as for child psychiatry. Unfortunately, in our, let's say in our environment, in our population, there are not a culturally competent or Spanish-speaking physicians, and so we pride ourselves and we can offer those services here. And that's been very important also, and it's part of our talk today, being culturally competent. We'll talk about that at the end. What are our objectives? These are the ones I came up with, but if you have others that you would like to add on, please let me know and we'll work on those as our talk goes on. We're going to identify, kind of give a description of who the Latina girl is in the US. Kind of the lifestyle or the kind of the major rankings, major rates of certain behaviors in the Latina girl in the US. Now, a side note, who knows the difference between the word Latina and Hispanic? It's hard to tell. Some people say that Latina is only from Latin America, right? Hispanic is Central America plus Latin America, but actually in this talk, we're gonna take it as Hispanic and Latina are basically the same. They're synonyms, okay? So there is some Spanish origin. So wherever the Spaniards landed, and if you're from there, you're Hispanic, except if you're from Spain, because then you're Spanish, or you're a Spaniard. So it's very important because you'll see in articles, Hispanic, Latina, some people do differentiate some of the definitions. Describe adolescent suicide in the US. Well, this talk is not about suicide in the US. That would take a whole day or more, right? So we're gonna give some tidbits, basically so we can find a flow until we get to the Latina girl specifically in the US and suicide, which would be the third point. And then understand some of the aspects, some of the prevention and treatment aspects that we can contribute to our community. Again, Hispanics here, especially the kids, or what the Latina girls, and I'll mention that in a little bit, are the highest minority in the United States. And so, for example, here in this setting, how many, if you'll just raise your hand if you don't mind, how many are Hispanic? That's a lot of hands, right? And how many have girls? Or are obviously daughters, right? Of maybe immigrants or first generation, right? So this talk is gonna be, maybe you'll be able to say, wow, I remember that, or maybe that relates to me. And please participate if you care to do that. Okay, US Hispanic population. So in general, very important. As you notice, the Hispanics have accounted for more than half of the overall population growth in the United States. So this doesn't mean that half of the US population is Hispanic, but the growth of the population is basically half of it is due to Hispanics or Latinos. And there are more than 45 million of us in the United States at this point. Now, really think about it. This is census information. So this is probably an underestimate, because the census doesn't cover a lot of the illegal immigrants that have actually been working here for many years, or even their kids. So this is an underestimate. Hispanics take up more than 15% of the total population of the United States. That's a big number, right? And it's estimated that in 2050, the Hispanic population will reach 29%. So 1/3 of the population in the United States in 2050 is going to be Hispanic. So what does that mean to us? It probably means that about 1/3 of the population that we're going to see, right, are Hispanic kids that will need culturally competent individuals and understanding of all the interactions that they have with their culture, with their families, right, and how they interact with others. This is another very important aspect that we don't think about too much, but the population growth that we talked about, the 50% that is attributed to Hispanics, it's not so much, we hear on the news, the immigrants and the immigrants and the immigrants and the immigrants. But actually, when you really look at the numbers, the population growth is not because of the immigrants at this point in time. It used to be at some point in time. But at this point in time, it's a what we call the natural increase, which means the kids of the immigrants, right? Or second generation or third generation now. But our population, the Latino population, tends to be very, what do we call, how can we say that? Just very kind of set in ways at times. So the culture that's lived in the house continues, even if sometimes there's a third generation or a fourth generation. There's a lot of Latino aspects that are not necessarily lived outside of the house, and we'll talk about that also as a contributing aspect. 60% of the increase, like we said, is natural increase, and 40 is to international migration, or just people coming in. Okay, now, who is the Latino girl? Well, the Latino girl is ranked right now at this point as the largest minority group of girls in the country. That's a very powerful statement. And I'm thinking politics and all that kind of stuff also. But actually, for our population, that means that we really need to pay attention to this group of kids, right? Because they're not a minority for us. I think they're a majority for us. I think the majority of the kids that come into Clarity are of Hispanic origin, right? More than 5.5 million Hispanic girls under the age of 18 are living in the US today. There's more than 5.5 million of them. And when we think of these statistics, but we think about San Antonio and Bexar County, it seems like it's much more, right? How many of us, when we go to the mall, you really look around, the Hispanic population is very large. Hispanic girls make up 15.2% of the total number of American girls. That's also a very big number when you think about it. And now look at the kids. 1 in 3 Hispanics are children under the age of 18. So those are the kids that we see in school. Those are the kids we see at Clarity. And those are the kids that we see also in the outpatient mental health system, maybe. And that's what we're going to talk about also, because we just happen to be the population that seeks out mental health the least, even though we're one of the biggest populations of minority groups. Teenage pregnancy is still the highest among the Hispanic or Latin girls. Now, if you look at the numbers have kind of decreased. It's not as drastic, but it's still the highest. And why are these numbers important? Well, because this is a stressor, right? This is a stressor for the individual, this is a stressor for the family, this is a stressor for the community. So we'll talk about this and incorporate it in the talk later on. Hispanic girls, now we're kind of going to the grim. We talked about how powerful we are here because we have the powerful numbers, right? But now we also have some really scary rankings also. Highest rate of substance abuse is also in Hispanic girls, amongst all the girls, Hispanic girls. And they're least likely to report using condoms, which leads to pregnancy, leads to STDs, leads to a lot of other issues. 3 of the 4 most serious threats to health and education of girls today are ranked the highest in the Latin and Hispanic girls. So it seems very grim, like there's just a lot of things that go against, you know, the Latino girl. Pregnancy, depression, and substance abuse. So when we talk about these, then we are thinking, well, that's why. That's why suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide are so popular, or not popular, but so high ranking in the Latino girls. As we see in the studies though, in these studies, we don't have a lot of these studies, so we have to be careful with what we really take as a fact, right, when we see these studies. But actually, these are stressors that contribute to maybe behavioral and emotional changes, but not necessarily to the suicide attempts. What we're going to see later on is the conclusion that it's more about communication. And that's what we always preach. Communicate, communicate, and communicate, right? Whether they're Latino, whether they're African American, white, Anglo, it doesn't matter. Communication What we're going to see in the studies is the most important aspect. Yes?
Is depression and pregnancy and are they in order?
No, you know, I'm not completely sure. I didn't see the numbers on those. Are they in order of the rankings? Not necessarily, I don't think. They just mentioned the top 3. Okay, just the general graph, just so you can visualize that these are the leading causes of death among, this is not girls only, this is girls and guys, okay? Among individuals under 24 in the United States in 2006. So that's a pretty big chunk out of that pie chart, too big. And then we don't know, you know, the interpretation of other unintentional injuries. Is suicide there also? Because when families find their kids, right, you know, you have to investigate. Not everyone is clearly a suicidal intent, and not everyone that passes away that seems like it's a suicide or seems like it's an accident, maybe it was a suicide. So again, always take into account that there might be some numbers here that are not very clear. Suicide is it's a very sketchy thing sometimes. Okay. Now, adolescent, and I imagine you guys know kind of these numbers or statistics or even just the idea in general, okay? But this is adolescent suicide in the US. Not Latino, not Hispanic, just in general. It's the 3rd leading cause of death. That's a pretty scary thing. 3rd leading cause of death between the age of 10 and 24. I mean, we definitely need to do something about that. There are about, we don't know if that number is precise or not, but 4,500 or 4,500 deaths per year because of suicide. Again, those are very scary numbers. Causes, 46%, or half of them are because of firearms, 39% because of suffocation or hanging, and 8% because of toxic ingestion, right? Now, sometimes we think, again, this can lead into another conversation. Why firearms, right? Why are they so popular? That kind of thing. That's a whole different talk. But the problem with firearms is that they are effective. You don't have to try a lot of times to commit suicide with a firearm. A gun to the head is going to do it, right? But sometimes the hangings and the toxic ingestions, these are what are the repeated suicide attempts. Now, when we think of these, we think about the child that lost their life, right? Or the child that had the attempt and didn't lose their life. And that child is the one that's affected. But it's not the only individual affected. Suicide affects tons of people around them. Who does it affect? It affects the parents. It affects the siblings. I mean, imagine the kids that walk in on their, you know, teenage brother or sister, right? That was hanging, right? Or tried to help them and they couldn't, or tried to help them and they could. That's a whole different, you know, individual that's going to need help also. The parents and all the thoughts of the guilt, that kind of thing. How many of you have had to give talks and crisis talks because at school some classmate committed suicide, and then you need to talk to all the kids around because a lot of people feel guilty, very guilty, because why didn't I notice? You know, why didn't I notice that my best friend was going through this problem? So they take on a lot of the responsibility. The parents. So you see that suicide is not a problem only for the individual. It's not a situation where only that individual that attempted needs help. It's a situation where, at least 4 people around them need help, or 10, or 20, it depends who they touch, right? So in grades 9 through 12, and this is usually it's in the US in general, so it's not Barrett County, San Antonio data, it's the US data. 15% considered suicide. And I think that's not even the correct number. I think it's much higher. Because I think that when adolescents start talking about suicide, even if they're talking to a friend that's never been depressed, right? They have maybe some anxiety because they're going to have anxiety in their life, maybe breakups, things like that. That once you start talking about it, it becomes maybe an option, right? Not so much that it's a true option, but it becomes like, okay, it does exist. People do it. That's not necessarily, it's it's scary to think that it's an option, right? But it's not necessarily a bad thing that they talk about it, especially if they have, which we'll get back to that, communication, and they have good communication. So I think that 15% is undercutting it completely. I think that even if we were to raise hands here of who's thought about suicide when they were teenagers, it would be much higher than 15%. 11% a plan. Now that's another step. And that's a high number, but when you think about it, that's kind of saying that the majority of the kids that think about suicide are actually planning it, right? From 15 to 11, so it's 11%. So it's the majority of the 15% that are planning it. And then you have 7% of those that actually have a suicide attempt. Okay. But what is a suicide attempt? Actual injury to oneself. A lot of the kids that have self-injurious behavior, and Kathy's given talks about these, sometimes say, no, I didn't want to kill myself. Well, maybe they're not going to tell you that they wanted to, but they were actually planning on that. They didn't take it a step further. Boys have a higher rate of completed suicides than girls. Do you guys know why? This is a really important factor. They use firearms. That's exactly what they do. They don't, they in their minds, right, they have more access to it. They imagine that they can get it. They have more access through friends, through family and all that to get to the firearms, right, more so than the girls. And they tend to ask for help the least. In other words, they don't leave as so many signs and indicators that they are contemplating. They leave the message, right? They can leave the suicide note, but they're not necessarily communicating and texting and saying, you know, I'm feeling really bad, this kind of stuff before. Girls tend to do that a little bit more. And so that's why maybe girls can have a little bit more, people are maybe a little bit more alert, and we're talking in general, okay? The other is that, again, girls, they have the toxic ingestion. Toxic ingestion is girls try that as a suicide attempt more often. It can actually buy you some time because you get sick, right? So maybe family or friends or can get to them and get to the hospital much quicker. Okay. The hanging is actually also more common in boys than in girls. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of physical strength to be able to do that as well. So that's why you see it maybe more in the boys and less in the girls. And then you have, like we just mentioned, suicide attempts are more common in the girls than in the boys because the boys they're effective. You know, they do it, that's it. The girls will try and maybe try again and try again. Okay. Hispanic and Native American and Alaskan Native also have the highest rate of suicide-related fatalities. So actual suicide, carrying through the suicides, not the attempts or the plans. And 15 to 34-year-olds, it's the second leading cause of death. That's hard. Can you imagine it's the second leading cause of death in that age group? Hispanic kiddos between 9th and 12th grade, also the highest rate of suicide attempts. So we've talked about suicidal ideation, we've talked about suicide attempts, and we've talked about suicide itself.